All right. Thank you everyone for joining us for this first Behavioral Science Week session of 2024, a session on behavioral science and UN 2.0. So welcome to Behavioral Science Week. I just want to start with a few remarks about the week overall. So this week brings together 38 UN entities. It's quite remarkable where we are at the UN, considering the first Behavioral Science Week 6 years ago, we were only a handful. Now we are this many. So lots to think about and unpack throughout the week. Here's the agenda. We'll share the links with you in the chat if you want to know more beyond the session. We have topics ranging from data to health, to gender, even strategic foresight. So lots of different spaces to explore together throughout the week. Well, this is next week, obviously, as you can see from the agenda. But I'll leave that for you to unpack for the course of the week. But for now, for this session today, what we'll be doing is we'll be hearing from our panel shortly, and there'll also be opportunity to ask questions. So it's a big part of Behavioral Science Week is having the opportunity to engage with our speakers. So we please ask that you use the Q&A tool in the bottom of your screen. Use the box there. We won't be taking questions from the chat. You're able to chat with the speakers if you put questions into the chat, but we won't be taking questions from there. So put your questions in the Q&A box, and you can also upvote the questions of your colleagues in the Q&A box as well. So that's just basically some notes on how to run the session. But so with that, I'll get down to our first speaker today. We're very fortunate to have opening remarks from somebody who's, again, well known across the UN and the behavioral science community, Professor Cass Sunstein. He's a professor at Harvard Law School, the Robert Walmsley Professor. He is a prolific academic writer in many respects, writing books, many books, from ones like Sludge all the way to Nudge, lots to check out, and a new one that just came out on, well, they want to habitation, but then also one on more recently on how to become famous, which is I want to check out as well. So in addition to his academic and writing, he's been a key advocate and ally for practitioners in the behavioral science space. He's worked in the Obama administration and across governments, and now currently works in government too, but has also been a senior advisor to us in the UN over a number of years, but also organizations like the World Bank, the WHO, et cetera. So we're very fortunate to have Cass with us today to provide some opening remarks before we get on to the session. So with that, Cass, I'll stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And it's an incredible honor to get to talk to you all. And also, it's more than an inspiration. It's a thrill to see the astounding work done at the UN, which is improving the lives of, I think the technical term is zillions of human beings. And the creativity and initiative at the UN with Mary's leadership has been a beacon really for countries and international organizations all over the world. I've noticed in various nations and also in international organizations, just that tracking something that's happened at the UN is electrifying. It's not only massively important in itself, but it's important because of its signaling effect for others. By inclination, I write books. So I wrote a book for you. It's a little book. It's a very short book. It's a 5 to 6 minute book. It only has 3 chapters. You can think of it as past, present, and future, or you can think of it as the era of humanity, the era of sludge, and the era of dishabituation. Those are potential chapter titles. So past, or the era of humanity, I've noticed that in some domains, behavior or behavioral science are used in a kind of intuitive sense. So it's like a kind of vague concept that refers to any number of things. Behavioral science, as everyone on this call knows, is something extremely specific and new. It's not Aristotle, it's Kahneman and Tversky, it's not Kant, it's Eldar Shafir and Sendel Mullainathan. It's responsible not for Nobel Prizes of 40 years ago, but Nobel Prizes in the recent past. And it reflects a superior understanding of what people are like to what Aristotle and Kant, for their amazingness, lacked. And the era of humanity reflects, above all, 5 understandings of how humanity is. And it isn't, meeting people where they are or taking account of culture or understanding anthropology, it's something very particular. First, human beings are present biased. That is, the present is extremely meaningful and salient. The future is a foreign country. People aren't sure they're ever going to visit, and that can create a set of challenges for health and safety and for forward progress. For the UN, present bias is public enemy number one. We know, second, that human beings suffer or benefit from unrealistic optimism. I am intending to do these remarks in approximately 6 minutes. I'm aware that optimistic bias might well kick in. People who are aware of the risks of smoking have been found to think that their personal risk of lung cancer and heart disease is lower than that of the average non-smoker. Unrealistic optimism can create serious problems for individuals and institutions. Present bias and optimistic bias are a terribly dangerous combination. We know, third, that inertia is an immensely powerful force. People suffer from status quo bias, which means whatever they're doing now, they're likely to continue doing, even in circumstances in which doing that thing is harmful to, let's say, their own future and that of their community. Inertia can be enlisted. Shifting the default rule often leads to a long-term shift in outcomes, and that's because the burden of inertia changes. We know, fourth, that people hate losses. They dislike losses about twice as much as they like corresponding gains. That is a problem for social change. It makes, for example, a carbon tax very challenging. There are things to do with loss aversion. It can be enlisted, but it is often an obstacle to improvements in well-being. We know, fifth and finally, and this may be an umbrella concept, that human beings suffer from limited attention. They're able to focus only on the subset of things that matter. That's one reason why dark patterns are behaviorally smart, if frequently evil. That's why it is often important to trigger salience as a way of getting people to attend to something which they might otherwise ignore. Present bias, unrealistic optimism, inertia, loss aversion, and limited attention are the unholy quintet, we might think, of Homo sapiens, and they lead to opportunity for things like GPS devices, which can overcome unrealistic optimism and limited attention, automatic enrollment, which can overcome inertia and present bias, and warnings, which can counteract all 5 of these things. That's basically the past. It's also the present and the future. It's getting better, our understanding of humanity, but that's where we are. And we really weren't close to there in, let's say, 1965, which in the lifespan of our species is the blink of an eye. Chapter 2, sludge and scarcity. The present of behavioral science, what's been really extraordinary to observe at in many international organizations, including the UN and in many member states, as we call them, has been the intense focus on administrative burdens or frictions or sludge, understood as things that operate as walls, large or small, between human beings and things that can make their lives better. A sludge audit of the sort that the OECD has been promoting might produce knowledge that the level of administrative burden is much higher than anyone could possibly have wanted, and that the disgustingness of sludge, and the term is a little gross, is intentional to suggest that people get their feet stuck in something, which prevents them from getting, let's say, help in the case of domestic violence, economic benefits in the case of poverty, or green energy in the case of climate change. We know that the United States sludge audit results in knowledge of 10 billion hours in paperwork burdens imposed on people. That involves hospital workers, it involves patients, it involves truck drivers, it involves people seeking permits and seeking authorization to do things. The Department of Homeland Security, where I work, has had a goal of eliminating 20 million of its 200 million hours in paperwork burdens. That goal has succeeded. We have achieved more than 20 million hours in reduction. The effort to cut sludge has helped to enable people to get benefits of many diverse kinds, all of them associated in one or another way with the Sustainable Development Goals. The horror of sludge is associated with what I think is the coolest recent assortment of findings in behavioral science, which has to do not with economic scarcity, but with cognitive scarcity. The number of things to which people can attend is a subset of the number of things that they ought to attend to because their minds have limited processing power. Sludge in those circumstances is close to a violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and sludge reduction is a good war. That's the present, and we're seeing that in multiple domains, and it's eminently feasible to reduce sludge. The future, I'm suggesting with some caution, is not only a barking dog, whom you're hearing downstairs, but is also alert to a phenomenon that's just starting to get attention, which is habituation. So if you go in a room that is full of smoke, at first you'll feel terrible in the nose, in all likelihood, but after about 20 minutes, you won't notice it. If you go to a place where there's terrible pollution, in the first week, it's going to be really bad. There's a good chance that after a few weeks, you won't notice it much. Pollution and an absence of freedom and a presence of discrimination are three things to which human beings habituate. This is a feature of our brains. It's something that shows diminishing sensitivity to stimuli. It's a blessing in the sense that we don't smash our heads against a wall, we habituate, but it's also a curse in the sense that we get used to terrible things, and that can make progress in achieving the sustainable goals very challenging. What there's increasing behavioral science on is the sources of success for dishabituation entrepreneurs. And the Sustainable Development Goals can be seen as exercises in dishabituation entrepreneurship. It's possible to give people a kind of critical distance from the practices that surround them, which make things that are really not good seem not like background furniture of life, but like something that is harmful and changeable. The fact is there are particular strategies that can be taken to introduce dishabituation in the face of desirable change, and we know increasingly what those concretely are. The lesson for chapter 3 of this tiny book is that we should all try to be dishabituation entrepreneurs. Dishabituation is eminently doable, and the predictability of habituation is associated with the fact that if you give people a little critical distance from something not good that they're living with, you can produce a healthy, freedom-fueling fire. Thanks all. Thanks for your work, and it's a great honor to get to talk to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Cass. Amazing. You synthesized and did all of that in only a few minutes. Thank you for your book. Greatly appreciate your effort and time to share that with us. I did want to mention in your 3 chapters, I think you have books about at least one book about each chapter. So there's Nudge. If you want to know more about the first part of Cass's talk, feel free to jump in with more. The second part, Sludge, I'd say is probably the one that gets at a lot of that. And the third is called Look Again, which is more recent. I think it just came out earlier this year. So if you want to know more about the chapters of Cass's book, you can also dive deeper into that. So thank you so much, Cass, for your comments and for inspiring us all to kick off Behavioral Science Week. And yeah, looking forward to engaging with you more in the future as we apply behavioral science across the UN. Thanks, Cass.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, now on to the next part of our session for today. So I'm going to just speak very briefly about behavioral science across the UN and UN 2.0, because that is in the title of today's session. So just very briefly to give some context in terms of where the UN is overall. So I didn't actually introduce myself. My name is Mary McLennan. I'm the Senior Advisor on Behavioral Science to the Executive Office of the Secretary General. I also lead an initiative called the UN Behavioral Science Group, which is illustrated by this slide. So the group brings together over almost 6,000, I think over 6,000 when we last counted, colleagues, members from both in the UN and outside, coming from over 70 UN entities and 150 countries. So lots of interest and demand for behavioral science across the UN and beyond, and lots of variety in this group as well, from colleagues starting out to ones who are more experienced. So lots across the UN. Now, speaking about UN 2.0, so setting us up for that, this document called Our Common Agenda, you might have heard of it. It's essentially the Secretary General's plan for his second term. And it's quite an ambitious agenda, which is about inclusive networks and effective multilateralism. So topics like health and climate and gender are really explored in interesting ways there. But for the sake of our conversation today, what I did want to highlight is one specific part of our common agenda, which is called this UN 2.0 Quintet of Change. So these are essentially 5 areas the Secretary General has deemed important for the UN to be nimble and effective and really deliver on this ambitious agenda. And they are data, digital transformation, innovation, strategic foresight, and of course, behavioral science. So really amazing to see behavioral science elevated up there in this way. And just to underscore again, it's about this forward-thinking culture of the UN. So how can we make the UN equipped for what's needed in today's world to really do the work within the UN as well as in collaboration and partnership with member states? So that's the quintet. We'll put in the chat some resources if you want to know more about that overall. There's a website. There was a UN 2.0 week, which happened only a few weeks ago. So there's lots to check out if you're interested in the other areas and how behavioral science fits into those two. Okay, so now just diving a little bit deeper into behavioral science, the Secretary General has called it a critical tool for the UN to progress in its mandate, also strongly encourages colleagues to work together. That's what we do in the behavioral science group. So we won't go into too much detail here, but if you want to know more, there are resources, including a guidance from Secretary General. Again, those are in the chat. And if you haven't already, you can join the UN Behavioral Science Group, which, as mentioned, brings together many colleagues from the UN and beyond. We have events like Behavioral Science Week, but also throughout the year, you can join the conversations with the UN and partners as we progress behavioral science. Okay, so with that, on to our speakers for today. So we'll be hearing from 3 speakers. So now that we've been inspired by Cass, got a little bit of a tour of behavioral science is, the potential it can have in different areas. We'll hear from Claudia Costa Martinelli Wehbe from the government of Brazil, where she's the director of innovation. And she'll speak to the Brazil government's experience exploring behavioral science applications, so taking some of those ideas that Cass mentioned in practice. And then we'll hear from we'll hear from Cash Ramley from UNICEF, who will speak to us about some of the experimentation that's incorporated in behavioral science thinking. And then also Eileen Tomio from the World Bank, who will be speaking about more behavioral science principles and concepts as well. So we'll dive deeper into the different ways we can actually apply behavioral science in practice. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Claudia. Over to you.
Thank you, Mary. Well, I feel so honored to join this lineup today and launch the 6th UN Behavioral Science Week and be able to share some of our recent experience with applied behavioral science within the Brazilian government. And I must start saying that behavior insights is not necessarily new to the Brazilian government. In fact, we can trace some initiatives back to 2017, both at federal and municipal level, mostly within innovation labs, with important contributions from our National School of Public Administration. But what was until then isolated fronts had a major shift last year with the inauguration of President Lula's 3rd presidential term and the creation of the Ministry for Management and Public Service Innovation. So it's the first time you have a ministry exclusively dedicated to steering and strengthening core management functions of government, such as people management, digitalization, public procurement, and also with the mission to innovate in the support and implementation of public policies. And the creation of the ministry provided a fertilized soil for us to advance behavioral science as a relevant innovation agenda and to grow the idea of a behavioral insight hub here. And so last year we did launch Cinco, our unit, a pioneer unit with the mission to find creative solutions to policy challenges. by applying behavioral science. And what we do in Cinco encompasses three major roles. The first one is to create awareness on the potentials and ways to apply behavioral science in the government. And in this advocacy role, we curate relevant content and disseminate them through our social medias, newsletters, and events. We hold lots of them. And also involved in developing tools and methodologies for the Brazilian context. And we're on the final stage, for example, of our anti-sludge tool, based on a method for identifying and reducing sludges within public service. And in this case, we had valuable contributions from the OECD Anti-Sludge Academy and the government of New South Wales in Australia, as well as our digital government secretary in the ministry. And of course, I must say that Mr. Sunstein's work has been a huge inspiration for us in this topic, as well as in many others. Third and finally, Cinco also develops projects partnering with other organizations using behavioral tools to improve policymaking in Brazil. And I should mention some of them ahead. But I would like to highlight that though we're on our early stage, I do want to share some takeaways collected along our journey so far. And the first one is that we know behavioral science is not supposed to be a silver bullet for public policy, but it does provide a valuable route to bring into consideration a perspective many governments still lack, which is the citizens, the one from citizens using our services. And I've been a civil servant for 20 years now, proudly. And it's interesting for me to think the assumptions we've had over the people we're serving with our policies, how they behave and interact with them, and more strikingly, to think how much of those assumptions have affected our policy's performance and its overall effectiveness. And well, another note I'd like to bring is the one that we can borrow from innovation endeavors more broadly, is that behavioral science, we find it as a sports team, in a team sport, a team sport. And I refer to that we need to assemble an engaged, diverse, and multi-talented team. And I know this might not sound so obvious for government because we have all these personnel rules and so, but in our case, we benefited from a temporary special power in a ministry to recruit people from universities, agencies, and ministries. And this made it possible for us to gather a team with not only researchers, but also project managers, communication experts, designers, and this all has been proving very useful for us. And even though we are aware that such a great team will help, we know that to fulfill our missions, we need to go beyond the walls of our ministry and empower and support more and more people to embed behavioral science systemically. And in this case, in our country, we have launched SyncoNet, which is our network, where we're cultivating this ecosystem in Brazil. And I shall mention how enriching it is for us to be able to join and interact and learn with the UN BeSci group, also with OECD and other colleagues. Another lesson I'd like to bring in, which I also borrow from innovation projects, is build a learning culture and iterate. And this is so important, both with regard to stimulate ongoing learning in our team, but also to promote a safe space for us to test, to fail, and to learn throughout the process. And I know it's not easy for governments to recognize and deal with failure, right? But being evidence-based, I think, encompasses recognizing that sometimes evidence will show you're wrong, and this is not necessarily bad. You need to gain a deeper perspective of reality. So in our case, even though we're pretty much eager to go out and start working with big projects, we found out that it was important to step back and review our business model and work to first better define behavioral problems. So we set a journey, we selected 10 out of 40 candidates to coach defining these problems. And soon we'll move on to a new stage where we work with them to identify barriers and also facilitators for behaviors and generate insights, test them, and so on. And a strategy that has underpinned our work is to have a diversified project portfolio that allow us to showcase potential applications for multiple policy sectors and give them more sophisticated tools beyond the traditional sticks and carrots for policymaking. So today, our current portfolio themes spans from promoting sustainable procurement to reducing energy consumptions, accelerating agroecology transition, fighting people trafficking, and so on. And you can see they're pretty much aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, just to name a few of them. And so you can expect some interesting news coming from these projects a few months to go. And being aware of my time, that it's finishing, a closing remark would be that transforming governments must entail a move towards more humanistic and empathetic approaches to people, and to understand them and to better take care of them. And in this journey, we recognize the importance to partner with science as well as a strong ethical commitment. And so I'd conclude by saying that may this following week be very insightful to all of us and expand our horizons towards a more transformative and effective policymaking. Thank you so much, Mary.
Great. Thank you so much for those remarks, Claudia. And to set the scene in terms of how we can actually do this within member states, within organizations outside the UN. So thank you so much for that. We'll come back with some questions for you during the Q&A. But for now, let's go on to our next for today's session. So I'm just going to share one slide really quick to get to Eileen. So just to now speaking a little bit about what behavioral science is more technically, right? So we've been inspired by Cass. We've heard from Claudia about, what we could do with it. Now, what does it actually mean in details and context? So in the UN, what we've done is we've taken this very broad definition of behavioral science. So essentially, we define behavioral science as an evidence-based understanding of how people actually behave, make decisions, respond to programs, policies, and incentives. So we make assumptions in our policies or programming. We can take a deeper dive understanding of them with the application of behavioral science. So we'll learn about that from our next speakers. But what I will just say here to kick us off is there are two components of this definition we often refer to. So the first is this idea of behavioral science principles. So thinking about concepts, ideas from economics, psychology, sociology, anthropology, and thinking, how can we embed those into our thinking processes when we're working on our work in the UN and outside. And the second component is that we test possible. So although these principles are very interesting on their own, as we'll see, it's also important to understand what works in different contexts and why. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Eileen. Over to you.
Thank you, Mary. Hi, everyone. I'm super happy to be here today with such important speakers. Let me share my screen first. There we are. So I will start the talk today with this simple exercise. So here you're seeing two figures, but we don't know how these two figures are called. I know one of them should be called Kiki and the other one Boba. So I will ask you now, you will see in the screen a poll. And the question is, which one of these figures is called Boba for you? Is it figure 1 or figure 2? I hope everyone is seeing right now in the screen the poll, the question. Which one of these figures do you think is called Boba? Figure 1 or figure 2? Let's see the answers. Okay, so most of you, around 90% answer figure 1. This is called the Wehbe-Kiki effect or the Kiki-Wehbe effect. Most respondents tend to respond Wehbe that the Wehbe is the first figure, intuitively associating form with type of sound. And this is the case even turning around the order of the figure that you see here in the screen. Basically, this is a non-arbitrary mental association between certain speech sounds and certain visual shapes. An example of how our mind has heuristics that help us get to conclusions even when we don't know why. I imagine that you don't have a real reason or a very detailed reason on why you think Wehbe is the first figure, right? And this is a very strong effect that has been seen to happen worldwide, even across different cultures and languages, and even for children as young as 2 years old, which means that probably this association between sounds and shapes precede language learning. Usually the most common theory about this has to do or stipulates that we associate the rounded shape that we make with the mouth with rounded figures. So that's why we usually think Kiki goes with figures 2 and Wehbe with figure 1. So, and you now may be thinking, what has this to do with behavioral science? Well, it has to do a lot. In traditional economics or traditional public policy, we are taught that human beings, or at least we think in general that human beings are rational, selfish individuals that only focus on their individual goals. In general, we consider that usually humans make decisions in a deliberative way. So we think through the decisions to avoid any systematic error, that we are egocentric, that we are always trying to maximize our own welfare above everything else. Finally, that we are objective, that the things, how we understand and perceive the world is the way the world is. However, decades of psychological research have shown that people are malleable, emotional beings, and that our decision-making is influenced by contextual cues, social networks, and social norms. A little bit what Cass and Claudia have already mentioned before. So we usually, in behavioral science, tend to think of humans as people that are also decision makers that usually make automatic social and preconceived decisions. What do I mean with this? So we think automatically. This means that when deciding what to do, we usually draw on what comes to mind effortlessly. We feeling missing information based on our assumptions about the world. We think socially, we tend to cooperate as long as others do the same and rely on our social groups and social norms. And finally, we think with mental models. These associations that we had with the figures and the sounds have to do with the fact that our brain works in a certain pattern, in a certain way, but also our culture shapes the way that we think, and making us use, rather than each time we're going to make a decision, thinking every aspect of the decision again, we just use mental models that we have learned in the past. So how do we sketch this? Usually, when we think of a decision, we represent it like this. So, for example, let's say I want to be healthy and I think I should use the bicycle to go to work in order to move a little bit every day. Then what should I do? Well, clearly buy a bicycle and start using it to commute. Oh, sorry. Little issue with the headphones. So what I was saying, what should I do if I want to be healthy? Then buy a bike and ride to work every day. And that will get me to the outcome that I want, that is arrive or feel more healthy each day. And if I want to do this, then logically I will buy the bike and start riding to work. And if I don't, I just would grab the car and keep my life as it was before. However, decisions in reality are not that simple. A decision-making process looks more like this. We usually factor things such how we feel at the time of doing the action, what I think is expected from us, how easy or difficult it is, if I feel my peers will do the same. And all of these factors affect the final outcome of my behavior. So as behavioral scientists, when we think about how to nudge people into behaving in a certain way, we need to think about all of these factors that affect how people will make their decisions. For example, do people know that using the bicycle will help them to stay healthy in the example that I made before? Or do they think that just eating vitamin gummies will make the deal and not think of another alternative? How easy is it to get a bike and ride to work, right? There you have the pragmatism of the action. Then analyzing the environment, such as if roads are prepared for safely riding bikes, if offices offer the space for people to shower and change after arriving from the commute. Resources constraints, for example, are very important, like having enough time to ride to work, or even if people have the money to buy bikes. And finally, the process, how easy it is for people to find the right bike, to find how to ride to work, and where to leave their bikes in a safe space. So standard policy tools usually focus on information, giving incentives, or banning stuff across through regulations and laws. A behavioral approach instead tries to focus on mindsets, decision-making frames, of course, as I mentioned before, the social environment. And this is something Mary mentioned. Behavioral science draws on a variety of disciplines, including economics, ecology, anthropology, sociology, neuroscience. So the standard policy tools often rely on the idea that humans are rational, as I said before, objective. However, the behavioral science tools will take into account all these subjective and emotional aspects that actually influence decisions and behaviors. This knowledge is specifically, or even more important, when we're talking about vulnerable communities. So this is something Cass mentioned before. We know that poverty reduces cognitive capacity, our executive control, our capacity to start and stop certain behaviors and adapt to the context. And then mental burden related to financial worries or basic needs worries usually hinder people's problem-solving abilities. So what we know right now is that people in poverty tend to rely more on automatic thinking versus deliberative thinking. So we need to take into account these contexts in order to understand why they make the decisions they make. And this is true not only for households, but also for decision makers. In developing countries where present-related problems outweigh future-related issues, usually teams are focusing on specific things that they need or solving basic needs and cannot pay attention to long-term goals that are probably more helpful to alleviating poverty and improving economic measures in the long run. So we are arriving to the end of this presentation, and let me show you a little bit the behavioral methods and the process we use specifically at the World Bank, at my team that is the Mind, Behavior and Development Unit, but I know that similar teams across the UN use similar steps to address behavioral challenges. So 3 key features are the main or describe the behavioral approach, which are context-driven, evidence-based, iterative processes. That's why the infinite figure that I'm showing you right now. So our processes usually start with definition and diagnosis of the problem. This means that first we work a lot on identifying the problem, collecting background information and available data on the main issue, trying to do diagnostic sessions with our target populations to understand what are their issues, what are their bottlenecks related to the behaviors that we are trying to promote, And we also do field work, which includes both quantitative and qualitative methods in order to gather information on how they feel, what are their beliefs, what are their attitudes towards the issue that we are trying to solve. Then the second step is designing. Usually we try to collaborate with different stakeholders, developing a list of potential interventions, narrowing down most feasible interventions, to next try to implement them and evaluate them. Here, very important for us is trying to pilot the different interventions before scaling them. We usually use experiments, which Cash, who is following me in this webinar, will talk a little bit about this section of the behavioral work. We try to use experiments, randomize groups, use a control measure to understand causality in our interventions. And once we have actually come up with a conclusion, or for the evidence that shows what works in the context that we're working, we try to adapt, to identify the key learnings, identify areas for further work. This opens up a new start of a project, redefining and re-diagnosing whatever is needed to scale up the work that we've done and identify further behavioral challenges. So what I've shown you before is like the theoretical steps. Now, let me tell you one last thing, and I'm going to finish with this. Usually the way in the practice that this work is that even though all the stages are important, we usually spend a lot of time in understanding the problems in the problem definition phase and defining the target populations and behaviors. And then the diagnose phase, trying to understand the bottlenecks that hinder the desired behaviors. And why is this? Well, because if we don't pay a lot of attention in understanding the behavioral issues and learning the contextual and psychological factors that influence people's decisions, then the chances of implementing something successful will probably decrease. That's why we stress a lot to give us time, or try to dedicate a lot of time to trying to understand your target population and the actual behaviors that you think will help them to improve their living. So that's all of my sides. Thank you very much. I hope this was a clear introduction to behavioral science. And now I'll leave you with the rest of the speakers.
Great, thanks for that, Eileen, for getting set up with some of the context there. So just wanted to clarify, you can put your questions in the chat. There's the Q&A box, not the chat. Put your questions in the Q&A box for Eileen. Is this clear? Do you know this already? Is there something that Eileen said surprising? Anything? We're open to have a conversation about it overall. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. We can take those forward. And there's no, I mean, any question is fine. This is meant to be a discussion. And for colleagues who are new to behavioral science as well as experience, so it's a safe space here. You can ask any question you might like. Okay, so with that, maybe over to Cash if you want to go for a few minutes, if we can, to get to some questions near the end. Thanks, Cash. Over to you.
Thanks, Barry. So let me just get my screen. Cool. So as Eileen pointed out, one of the components and one of the USPs of behavioral science is the fact that it's evidence-based. So I'm here to talk to you about how we generate evidence and one of the main methodologies we use and why it's valuable. So first, I want to talk about this concept of correlation and causation, right? So many of you might have heard the term correlation doesn't imply causation. That's not 100% true, but for the sake of conversation today, we can assume that correlation doesn't imply causation. And so here's a perfect example of it, whereby if you look at data on shark attacks and ice cream sales, they strongly correlate. And so this typically suggests that like people who consume ice cream or the sales of ice cream leads to increases in shark attacks, which sounds silly when you state it in this way. So how do we... but if we wanted to truly evaluate this, then what we would do is run an experiment. So we would evaluate this using an experiment where we would randomize, we get a subpopulation of people, so these lovely people over here. We randomly allocate them into the treatment group or the control group, where the treatment group receives ice cream and the control group doesn't receive ice cream. So the purpose of randomization is that it's statistically, we can assume that there's an equal distribution of different types of people, right? So over here, we can see equal distribution of people in green shirts, people with beards, men, women. So through randomization, you can assume that it's the same group of people, which then means that any effect that you find is due to the intervention as opposed to differences between those two groups. And so here, if we give people in the treatment group ice cream, and then we can measure the amount of shark attacks within their group compared to the people in the control group that don't receive ice cream. And I mean, if you were really to do this, you would find that there isn't actually a difference in shark attacks between the treatment and control group. Whereas the explanation might actually be the sun or warm weather. So when we see warm weather, we see increases in ice cream sales. Equally, when there is sun, more people go out swimming, which then leads to greater shark attacks. And so that's probably what's causing that correlation to appear. But that's why you should run experiments, and that's the purpose of it, is to kind of isolate these effects and to try and understand what's driving the effect that you see. So why are experiments valuable to programming in general, to behavioral science programming in general? So experiments allow precise estimations of the impact of an intervention. So for example, after running an experiment, you can say, like, on average, the behavioral science intervention led to an increase of vaccinations by 12%. So it's much easier to put a figure to it. This also allows you to conduct cost-benefit analysis to really understand what the true impact and what the cost of that intervention is for any behavioral science intervention. Additionally, it generates better evidence for partners, so whether that's donors, other organizations, and we're starting to see a shift in this trend where more and more donors are demanding experimental or something close to experimental evidence to prove that what you're doing is truly effective. And also, it generates stronger evidence for influencing policy. So that's not really true, because what we do know from research is that actually policymakers do not value experimental evidence more than non-experimental evidence. But we're starting to see a shift in that as well, as more and more people learn about the value of experiments, such as all of you today. So why is it important to behavioral science more specifically? Is that it allows for robust testing of mechanisms driving that behavior change. So you can isolate some of the things that you might think might be driving the behavior in an experiment, and that will allow you to explain the mechanisms of the behavior change that you're observing. So it's not just knowing about whether the intervention worked or not, but actually the underlying mechanisms that might be driving that. It allows for replications across different contexts, which then allows us to identify interventions that are consistent. As we know, context really matters, cultures differ, people differ across geographies based on various factors. But when we run experiments in all of these different contexts, we get an understanding of what the commonality across these differences might be. And that helps us to design interventions that are more easily scalable, things that we can go to a new context and be fairly confident that it will drive the behavior change that we want. Similarly, that evidence contributes to the broader body of behavioral science to inform future interventions, and it addresses the specific issue that we have in behavioral science called the WEIRD problem. WEIRD stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic. So basically, a lot of the evidence base in behavioral science at the moment comes from Western countries, Western universities. And so they're not truly generalizable to the rest of the world, especially in all the countries that the UN works in. And so by running more experiments, we get to feed into this body of evidence to really understand the differences in cultures for these different interventions. So there's three main criticisms that that is often raised when it comes to experimentation, and that is it's too expensive, it takes too long, or it's potentially unethical. So my counter to those 3 points is it's typically more expensive or unethical to scale programs that have not been proven to be effective. So if you don't know truly that an intervention actually works and you don't have evidence for that, to then roll it out to the rest of the country or the rest of the community means that you might be throwing away resources on something that doesn't really work. And to me, that there's an argument about ethics around that point in itself. Or on the other side of it, you don't have evidence that it actually causes more harm than good. And in that sense, it can also be unethical. And also wasting resources is unethical. To address the issue of experiments taking too long, well, there are new methods around causal inference and experimentation that can reduce these times. There's adaptive trials, sequential testing, but also we can use administrative data in places where there is enough administrative data already being collected to evaluate these behavioral science interventions, because it reduces the cost of going in and collecting data from every single person. So finally, just wanted to highlight a few examples of where we run experiments across the UN. So the first one on the left here is from the World Bank on using behavioral science concepts in their communication to improve solid waste management in Argentina. On the right is from UNICEF, where they tested different forms of messaging, again, applying behavioral science in text messages and in emails to try and increase the vaccination rates of HPV in Georgia. And we have tons of other examples, such as changing norms around immigrants in the country or reducing friction to encourage more chlorination of water, so generating clean water, and then reframing food choices to help improve nutrition and decisions around diet. Thank you. Oops.
Great. Thank you so much, Cash, for that quick run through of experimentation. Okay, so now on to some Q&A. I have some really great questions coming through. Thank you for all your questions. Everyone put their, Claudia, if you want to turn your camera on again, there are a few for you as well. And I think you can comment on all of them, given your work within the behavioral science community there. So maybe we'll back up a bit and start with Claudia, some questions for her. So you see Rashana Sharma, she's our colleague from UNICEF, if I recall correctly, who's working in Ethiopia to work with the government there to embed behavioral science. So she's asking, it looks like from her perspective, I'm maybe elaborating here, but she wants to know on your authority, or how do you actually work with maybe different parts of the government when what mandate or what role do you have to play? Is it, do you choose projects, or what authority and how much influence do you have essentially across government overall? So that's one question. As she reflects upon the Ethiopian context, how they position that unit there. And then the other one is particularly your engagement with youth and adolescent groups. I'm not quite sure with respect to what, but how you engage with maybe different populations outside of the government as well. So over to you, Claudia.
Thank you. Well, I'll start with the last question regarding the engagement with youth and adolescent groups. So far, we haven't had a direct engagement with them, but we do have in a network a lot of graduate students from some professors that are already working with us, and they are engaged in the network, taking place and participating in our events and everything, which I think it's very exciting. And going to Ms. Sharma's question, I should say our approach is not to have a top-down approach to behavior science within the government. We do have a privileged locus to work from, which is the ministry that oversees main government functions. And this gives us great visibility. This gives us an outreach to recruit partners and to have people engaging with us in projects. But in fact, we don't force anything. We don't have, saying, hey, you have to go through this process and everything. We don't believe that. We believe more in having evidence-based projects and influencing in a soft power way. So I'm not sure if this answers Ms. Sharma's.
I think it does. I think it does to some extent. Thank you, that Claudia. I mean, there's more we could explore and unpack about how to do this in member states and governments. But I feel like you can also comment on the other questions we have here too. So please feel free to jump in as we have them. I'll just group a few of them I think they're for Eileen and Cash, but feel free to comment as well. So I think there are some comments here on so some of the methods, right? So I'm just going to paraphrase some of them. So Eileen, you spoke about we often hear about formative research and the diagnostic, maybe just to elaborate more on the diagnostic component you mentioned in that affinity diagram that you showed. And then also some work on, there's some questions on organizing evidence outside weird populations. How do you do that overall in terms of this your infinity, Eileen, and then also Cash too? You mentioned that in your remarks. And then also behavioral science takes a long time to include results, potentially, maybe not. Does society change rapidly to the degree? So how do we, by the time we generate results, how does that impact the work that we're doing? How do we basically bring into our understanding, adapting, changing context in terms of what we're studying as well? So maybe I'll leave it there for a few around that. So maybe Eileen, over to you first about the diagnostic. Anything else?
Sure, yes. So we usually, in fact, in the diagram I showed you, we put defining phase and diagnosing phase together because we think they are always interconnecting. First, you try to understand the issue at hand, and usually what we start doing is a desk review, trying to find what information is out there, what papers, academic papers are related to the behaviors that we are trying to tackle, what has been done in the past, what has worked, what hasn't. And once we have that information, the second step would be like a stakeholder mapping, trying to understand all the actors that would be involved and who we should try to contact to do key informant interviews. So these interviews would be based on people that know about the issue or are related to the issue in a certain way, and they can bring information for us to start looking a bit more and trying to understand what are the real behaviors that are going around and influencing the issue, the policy issue. And then we try to start the field work, this idea of the formative research that could include qualitative work and quantitative work. I do think qual work, even though it's not representative of the population, it's a good option when you have time constraints, because you can grab a few key populations of people that could bring information that is relevant for you, try to understand what their needs, their beliefs, their attitudes are, and draw some conclusions, or I would say insights. Get some insights of where might the issue be going, what is the direction, what are the possible solutions. The quantitative work usually takes more time. You need to find a representative population, and you can draw conclusions that are, you can generalize to your target population. We usually try to use both because, again, each type of method, it's biased. It has some pros and some cons. So I would suggest always, when you have time, try to use them all. But yeah, those are a few of the things that we usually use in order to get some ideas for them to implement and test.
Any other reflections on that? Or Cash, did you want to come in on the weird point that you mentioned?
Yeah. Wait, what was the question? It was, what were we doing?
Are there efforts towards
taking?
organizing evidence towards generating outside weird populations? How is the field dealing with this, Cash?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a conversation you and me had, Mary, about how can we better organize, because we recognize that all these different UN agencies are running these experiments and gathering all these valuable information. And I guess as practitioners, our focus is not less on publications and sharing and everything, right? We're so focused on like implementing policy, but ideally we would try and coordinate all these different efforts and create a central system where we can store this evidence so that it is very easily accessible and can be used even to conduct meta-analyses that include evidence from many different countries, so that we can truly understand what these effects are and then therefore contribute towards the weird problem in the world. But like we're in a position of privilege where we can answer these questions, right? Like it's as much of the criticism around weird populations is absolutely true. I think the issue is that academics will always be limited to the resources that they have within them, which is university students around the area. So yeah.
Oh, great. Thanks for that. All right. Okay. So I think there was another one, but let's just go to, can our panelists stay on for about 5 more minutes? Do you have time? Are you able to stick around? No more meeting? Okay, great. Thanks for that. Because I think there was also some questions here, which I think is probably quite relevant for this audience around behavioral, what are capacities and capabilities of a behavioral scientist? So I know you mentioned a little bit in your presentation, Eileen, of what behavioral scientists do, but there are questions around how should policymakers have or build a skill set in this space to process their policy making? And there's also a question regarding budding psychologists and what you might recommend for people who are starting out in the field, thinking about adding to their toolkit to prepare them for research in this area. So typically many programs are quite academic, not sufficient on the real world application. So someone who's maybe coming out of school with that kind of skill set, what might you recommend to them as well? So policymakers as well as people in school. So for all of you, I feel like you're all working with behavioral scientists. Who would like to go first?
I'll go, Cash.
Please, after you.
Okay, I was gonna mention a few, 3 things that I think are skills that are needed for this type of work. And it's not specifically just for behavioral science work, but also in general, policy making at this era, I would say, in this context of that it's ever changing. I would say first, having a growth mindset. This means being open to learning, to finding out what new information is out there, to understanding that what one thinks is not always, as I said before, objective. Instead, there are many types of knowledges, subjective views on a same issue. So being open to that, it's key to really being able to understand your target audience and design policies that are based on your population. Second, agility, being agile, trying, like always piloting different ideas, testing them. It could be a qualitative testing, a quantitative testing. There are different methods to try before scaling up, before saying this is the right path. Usually what behavioral science research has shown is that the right solutions depend on the context. So it's not that we have a one size solution for everything. So testing and seeing what works, what doesn't, and starting all over again is part of the mindset that I think policymakers and behavioral scientists should have. And finally, and this is related to Cash's talk, having an evidence-based mindset. Usually we think our own opinions are the right ones, and that we know we have this optimism bias, that we always know what's best for us and for others. Well, that's not always the case. So trying to find the evidence and pay attention to data, it's quite important for this field.
I'd agree with Eileen. In my case, I was thinking more about the capacity identified by the OECD, the core skills identified by OECD for public sector innovation would fit well here. And I'm saying to be data-driven, just like said before, have the user-centric approach, be in a way curious and challenge your thoughts about what is obvious. I think this is really important in terms of policy making. We assume sometimes we know a lot in our offices, and we don't go much out there and try to test and see things more profoundly. And also iterating, this being able to go out, test and learn and test again, and have this. And I really like how Eileen brought this infinitum image, because I think this is a good way to portray it. Some storytelling would work as well, because it's such a new area and people tend to, resist and sometimes. So I think I'd highlight those. And let me see, curiosity, insurgency. Yeah, I think those would be very interesting as well for policymakers to better embed behavioral sciences.
All very great, very good points, Claudia. Lots of overlap with the innovation space generally. Cash, do you have some thoughts? You studied behavioral science, no?
Yeah, but I can't
school?
top those two responses there.
Okay.
I can give you a boring one, which is like get good at researching, like get good at using Google and get good at statistics and data. Because that always helps, and that also allows a nice foundation for doing other things.
Definitely. I think in the definition, we started out with an evidence-based thinking, right? A lot of it comes with the research skills that Eileen mentioned, qual, quant, all the different ways. I think one of the questions was around how do you do rapid testing? So all these kind of methods can come into play depending on where we are. All right, so still lots of great questions, but I think we've gone over time already. So thank you for joining, first of all, to our panel. Amazing to have you all here, and Cass as well, and all your comments and reflections from your many years of work in innovation and behavioral science generally. So we will be in touch with the recording of this webinar. It'll be publicly available on our YouTube playlist, which you'll receive an email about shortly. And yes, also check out Behavioral Science Week, which is taking place next week, starting Monday with the high-level opening session. So with that, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having all of you here. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.